Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the vlog. Currently reporting from Beaumont, California, a small city maybe an hour east of downtown Los Angeles. I actually used to live in Beaumont for about a year, maybe a year and a half. I lived close by and I played at the local casino, Morongo. Some of you guys might remember vlogs from there. That was a good time. But times changed. I moved to LA and I don't really make it out here too often anymore. But man, it's definitely more my scene. There's so much peace and quiet. It's beautiful, much different than the city life. Anyway, we're not here to talk about the weather or how peaceful a city is, but instead to talk about poker. We're not going to be playing at Morongo though. Instead, I'm going to be going to a private game, and it's a private game I've featured on the channel a few times. It's a bunch of pretty much Morongo local friends, a cool group that I've been lucky to be a part of for a few years now. And yeah, that's what we're jumping into today. The stakes are, I think, 10-20, maybe 10-25. Buy-ins usually range from like $3,000 to $10,000. So yeah, there's a lot of money on the table. And because of this particular group, a lot of action. Plenty of ridiculous hands coming up, I'm sure. Before we jump into those, however, I wanted to mention that I'll actually be coming back here in 1 or 2 weeks to Morongo because they're expanding their poker room or having some grand reopening. They're having me come out for that, and I'm gonna host a 10-20 game on October 12th. Here are the details, and here's a phone number that you guys can call if you want to get on the list to play those games. I'm gonna be in there, of course, throwing some chips around, so if you guys want to be part of the vlog and of course play with me, this is the time and day to do that. I think the buy-in is going to be like 2,000 minimum, 10,000 maximum, which I think is a sweet spot. It's still a lot of money, but not so much that no one's going to be gambling. So I think the lineups will be fun. I believe we'll get like 1 or 2 tables going if I had to guess. So sooner is better if you guys want to come join. If you're not going to come out for that and you could care less what I'm talking about, that's great because I'm all done. Let's jump straight into today's poker session. All right, guys, here we go once again. Today's stakes are 10-25 no limit with the occasional $50 straddle. There's also some bomb pots here and there, so I sit down with $5,000. In the first interesting hand, I look down at King 10 offsuit. I raise it up to 75, and it gets to the small blind who makes it $235. Both of the blinds fold, but when it gets back to me, I decide to stick around. King 10 offsuit is a pretty trash hand to call it a re-raise with, but we have position. He made it very small out of position, and also this is a guy who I've played plenty against, and I'm happy to give him some chips if it comes to that. So we go to a flop heads up of 10-9-7 with 2 clubs. He continues for a bet of $250. With top pair, backdoor flush draw, we're definitely not going anywhere. Could even raise once in a blue moon, but I'm not sure this exact hand is the best to do that with. So I just call, which is standard, and we see the ace of spades on the turn. Obviously a terrible turn card as we lose to any ace high that was stabbing on the flop. My opponent continues now for $550, and despite the fact that he could very easily have an ace, we of course could improve to trip 10s, 2 pair if a king were to come, but what I'm really thinking is if I call here and a club comes on the river, we can use that as a bluff card as well. Folding is probably okay too, but I take the adventurous route and make the call once again, most likely planning to bluff a variety of rivers if it comes to that, but it turns out we might not need to bluff at all because it's the king of spades, giving me a nice 2 pair here. He bets $1,200 though, pretty quickly, and it's a little bit concerning because of course we're losing to Queen Jack, Ace King, and he's set, Ace 10. You know, there are some hands that have us completely wrecked. So I don't think raising for value makes much sense. Folding is probably way too tight since we've played this hand this far and now it's actually a pretty strong hand. So I don't think too long and decide to make the call. If he's got me beat, so be it, but he does not. Instead, he turns over Ace Jack of diamonds and we win the first hand. In the next one, there's an early position raised to $75 before middle position makes it $325. I'm looking down at pocket jacks on the button, and even though it's a little scary that there's a raise and a re-raise already, This is the type of table where pocket jacks are still a monster in this situation, so I'm going to raise for value. I make it 850. Initial raiser folds, but the initial re-raiser, the guy in middle position who made it 325, he comes along. So we go heads up in position to a flop of ace 10-5 rainbow. Obviously not loving it with the ace out there, but this is the kind of board texture that I'm going to bet all my hands on in this situation for a small size. So I bet around 25% of the pot once he checks to me. $450. Actually, I think that's exactly 25%. Nice. Anyway, he makes the call and we see the 6 of diamonds on the turn. He checks again. This time I check it back. Pretty normal hand so far. River is the 5 of clubs. He checks a third time. I check it back. Probably not getting called by worse. And it turns out we're going to lose to ace 4 of diamonds. Next, there's a limper from early position. Middle position raises to 100, and I'm next to act with pocket kings. One of the best hands ever created, so of course I'm going to raise. I make it $325. Early limper calls, even though he just limped in for 25. He calls the 325, and then the guy who made it 100 calls as well. Not really what I expected, but obviously happy to see it with a hand as strong as mine. 3 ways to a flop of queen 6-5 with a flush draw out there. Action checks to me. I bet $500. First player folds, second player calls. Nothing really too advanced about this so far. We've got an overpair, so we're just going to keep piling chips into the middle and hope that we're getting value from worse. Turn card, though, is a little bit concerning. It's the queen of spades. So the most obvious hand that we're getting called with on the flop now improves to trips, that being top pair, of course. He checks it over to me again, and back in the day, I would almost always check this back almost immediately, but it turns out that these kind of situations, you are not supposed to check back every single time. In fact, a small bet is in order with a wide variety of holdings, including bluffs and value hands like the one I've got. So I decide to stick to that plan. I put in another bet, but I don't want to go big here. $650. I know it looks like I put 1,000 in with that yellow chip, but I did announce $650. My opponent wastes not much time before check raising all in. $3,200. Kind of a nasty spot now for me. But what do we want to do? We are beating bluffs, of course. Say a hand like 7-8 suited, any flush draw, maybe a pair plus flush draw, hands like that, of course, we're in great shape against, or maybe not great, but winning at least. And of course, a queen has us essentially drawing dead. One of the things to note, however, is that his most likely queens would be a hand like ace queen and king queen. But since I have pocket kings, it makes king queen a lot less likely. Ace queen, of course, very possible. Queen jack suited, I mean, there's 2 possibilities of that. But the fact that I have kings, and of course that removal to king queen, plus all those potential bluffs this player might have, I think leans us towards a call. Can't just be folding over pairs to a check raise all in this situation. So after thinking it over, I decide to make the call. If you've got a queen, you're gonna have to show me, sir. But he says I'm ahead once I make the call, so that's exactly what we want to hear. He asked to run it twice. I, of course, don't have a problem with this. First river is the 9 of clubs. He says that's you, which is pretty sweet considering the pot is over $8,000 now. Second river, though, is the 3 of spades, so it does bring in the backdoor flush, and we're going to chop versus 5-4 of spades, which is one of those bluffs he might have had. It's a pair on the flop that turns a flush draw and decides to go with it. Nice play from him. Kind of had me thinking about a fold, but in the end, we get it all in and chop. Moving on to the next one, there's a button open to $225. A pretty big raise considering the big blind is only 25 bucks. But I'm in the small blind with pocket 9s, which is still a damn strong hand. So I'm going to go for a re-raise out of position here. No need to go too big though, since he already opened for such a big size. So I make it 750. Big blind folds, but the button is not going anywhere just yet. He comes along, so we're going heads up to a flop of king 6 deuce with 2 diamonds. Already we have an example of how tricky these pocket pairs can be to play, especially out of position when you don't hit a set. But I think since this is a king high board and it's pretty innocent aside from the flush draw, a small bet seems fine. So I put in $450, around a third of the pot size. My opponent calls and we see the 7 of spades on the turn. Another small bet wouldn't be the worst thing ever, I guess, but I think checking makes more sense. Our hand kind of performs nicely as a check call, if you will, so that's what I do. But my opponent checks it back, so we're off to a river card, which is the 4 of clubs. I check it again, not really expecting to get called by worse. I did contemplate a small bet here, maybe even like a blocker bet type thing, but instead I just check it, trying to see what he does. And what my opponent does is throw in a healthy bet of $1,700, around 2/3 the pot size. And now we're in a really tough spot. This is a good bet size from him, making me essentially indifferent with a bunch of hands, pocket nines being close to that. What do we want to do? He could easily be value betting a king, of course, that checks back on the turn for some pot control. He could have a hand like 6-4 suited. He could have pocket fours. But I mean, aside from those hands, there's not many value bets, I think, that this guy could have. He could also have some bluffs, but the problem with those bluffs is I'd imagine they bet on the turn after I check, right? Like if he was planning on bluffing once he called a flop, then why would he check back the turn? I don't know. This is a tough spot, but in the end, I decide to lean towards a call, mainly because I've played with this guy so much that we have quite a history. And like I said against my other opponent earlier, this is someone that I'm happy to gamble with. If he's got it, he's got it. So I make the call and he says, "You win." So I just turn it over, never interested in making players show the losing hand. And sure enough, pocket nines are good, so we're going to take down this pot as well. So things are going quite nicely here. Let's see if we can keep it going. Early position opens to 75. There's one caller, and then a player in middle position makes it $325. I am on the button with King 7 of clubs, and I know what you're thinking. There's a raise, a call, a re-raise. What the hell are we looking at this hand for? Well, I'll tell you, it's because I decided to spring into action. I had a vibe that no one in this hand was particularly strong, and that paired with the fact that I've got position and a good image tonight makes this a fun candidate, let's say. So I make it $800 pretending I've got something good, which, you know, is kind of true. King 7 suited is really not that bad. Early position folds, but the guy who called the $75 raise, he calls my 800. And then the other guy who made it $325, he calls as well. So three of us go into a flop of 10, 6, deuce with one club. Very dry board. We've got an overcard, a backdoor flush draw, and I guess if you really want to stretch it, we've got a straight draw too. They check it over to me, and I don't know. I think checking back here is probably not great after bluffing pre-flop. Some hands might want to check back, but not this one. So I start with a small bet, trying to get this pot heads up. Wouldn't complain about taking it down right here on the flop, of course. So I put in $850. First player now thinks about it for a bit. Looks like he's going to fold, but then he says all in for like 4,000. Second guy folds, and of course I can't continue, so I let this one go. And that's the story of how I lost around $1,600 with King 7 suited for no reason. Moving right along, in this next one, there's an early position limper for $25. I look down at 10-9 of spades in late position, worthy of a raise, so I make it 100, and only the limper makes the call, so heads up to a flop of 7-4 deuce with one spade. He checks it over to me, and this is a board that I think a lot of players might down bet on, but I don't really think that's best. Don't want to get too nerdy, but anyway, I put in a bet of 2/3 the size of the pot, $150. My opponent makes the call, and we see the ace of clubs on the turn. Not necessarily improving my hand. You know, it would have been nice to turn a straight draw or a flush draw. Of course, a pair would be great too. But it is a card that I would often improve on, whereas my opponent would not improve too often on unless he called the flop with some sort of ace high, which I don't think is too likely since I bet large. Anyway, he checks again, and I decide to continue bluffing. This time, I bet around 1/3, $175. Once again, my opponent is not convinced. He makes the call, so we're looking to hit a 10 or a 9 on the river and just hope that that's good. Or, of course, bluff and try to steal this one. River's the 8 of diamonds, so we're sitting here with 10 high. My opponent checks again. Now, do we want to check back and give up? Sometimes giving up, I think, is okay, but not this time. I'm going to go for one last bet. A little more gusto might get the job done here, so I put in $700. Trying to put my opponent in a miserable spot with any single pair holding. He thinks it over for around a minute. Eventually shows me that he's got the deuce of diamonds, so he's got at least bottom pair, but he ends up folding, so that's quite nice. This is Ernie. I don't know how many of you guys remember Ernie from past vlogs. A great guy, but you got to show Ernie the bluff the times that we get him. So I turned this one over, and the whole table has a laugh at Ernie's expense. Memories. In the next one, there's a $50 straddle. I raised to 150 with King Queen and get 3 callers. So 4 ways to a flop of Queen 9-3 with a flush draw. We've got top pair, great kicker. This is a pretty strong hand, even though we are 4 ways. So when the action checks to me, I decide to bet half pot, 325. Plenty of draws and worse hands to get value from. So that's what I do. Big blind calls, and we go to a turn, which is a 5 of clubs. We're heads up now. My opponent checks. I decide to continue betting. Same logic as the flop. He could have a worse pair. He could have a queen with a crappier kicker. And of course, a plethora of draws available. So I'm going to just keep trying to get some chips in there. My opponent makes the call once again, so it's looking pretty good. But the river is the 8 of diamonds. So now Jack 10 suited, or I guess even just Jack 10 period, gets there as the most obvious straight draw on the flop. And if he had a flush draw all along, we're probably not going to get called by that anyway, right? So when he checks, I decide to just check this one back. Would be pretty frustrating to see a hand like Queen Jack or Queen 10 from my opponent, but I just thought it was a bit too thin. Turns out it doesn't make much difference because he says, "You got it, I missed." So I turn it over and we win this one as well. Next, the straddle is on once more. I raise it up to 150 with ace queen and get called by the player on my left and the straddler. So 3 ways to a flop of queen 6 deuce rainbow. First player checks. It's on me now. We've got top pair, top kicker. Almost always, I think a bet is in order here, but once in a blue moon, checking strong hands like top pair, top kicker for balance is a good idea, and that's what I employ this time. I check it. Player behind me checks, so 3 of us go into a turn, which is overkill. The Queen of Hearts giving me a very disguised 3 of a kind, I think. Straddler leads out, though. He makes it $150. Already, you could raise, I think. It might be a little bit weird because what bluffs would play this way, but I think if we're able to sprinkle in some bluffs here and there, then a raise is okay. However, I just call, hoping to keep the player behind me in, maybe even induce him to raise, since neither the straddler or myself look too interested in this one. However, the player behind me folds, so we're going heads up to a river, which is the 7 of spades. Shouldn't really change too much, I think, but my opponent leads out for a big bet, $1,100. Quite the overbet into this pot size of a mere $800. So yeah, I think against this size, I'm probably not gonna raise. If he had bet smaller, I most likely would have, but he just bet so large that it seems like a bluff, or maybe we're in trouble. So I just call, and it turns out he's got pocket 7s. So we had him in pretty rough shape. He gets there on the river, and we lose this $3,000 pot. Nice hand. Next, there's an early position open to 75. 2 players make the call, and I look down at pocket 8s in the big blind. Of course, we are not going anywhere. It's just a question of, do we want to re-raise, put on the squeeze play, or just call and try to hit a set? Both options I think are fine, but this time I decide to go for the raise. I make it $600 to go, hoping to get this hand heads up, but that's not what happens at all. The player on my left, who was the initial raiser, makes the call. Then the player next to act, she makes the call, gets to the button, and he doesn't call, but instead he back jams all in for around $2,200. I think the exact amount is $2,175. Let's just say this is not what I was expecting, but the action's back to me now, and it's already a weird spot. My immediate reaction is to jam all in myself, just to force out the 2 players behind me. But I feel like one of them, if not both of them, might actually have me beat with hands like pocket 9s, 10s, even jacks. They could have ace queen suited, all sorts of hands that I'm barely flipping against. And I'm not sure how much fold equity I actually have, because they both already put in $600 and they don't have a whole lot remaining. So I don't know, I felt a bit weird about all the options here. I decided to just call, which looking back, I don't really like. My hand's not really strong enough to call and give both players behind me a chance to continue. I think pocket 8s, it's best to just let it go or jam all in, but I decided to call, and then a little to my surprise, even though I did just call, both of the players on my left come along as well. So suddenly we're in this huge bloater, $8,700 in the middle, 4 ways. One of the guys is already all in. Yeah, this is standard issue Beaumont home game type of stuff. Anyway, we go to a flop of ace, queen, deuce, all hearts. So not the best board. I guess we have a flush draw, but aside from that, we're probably dead. Action checks around and we see a nice turn card. It's the 10 of hearts, giving me a flush. There are also so many high card hearts out there that my opponent's having a flush seems not super likely, unless they have like obviously the king or jack of hearts, but I'm feeling pretty good about my hand at this point. Still, I'm out of position and don't really want to bet into a dry side pot here, so I check it again. Now something weird happens where the player who's last to act, she folds out of turn, which is kind of funny. So suddenly, even though I'm first to act, we are heads up. So off to a river, which is the 4 of spades. I've got a flush and it seems like it's the best hand. It would be almost impossible to bluff in this spot though, so I think if I do bet, it should be small. And that's what I do, $1,200, a little tiny value bet. But my opponent folds right away, so we're just gonna show down against the guy who's all in. And it turns out he's got pocket deuces, which is a flopped set, but of course no good against my 8 high flush. He's pretty frustrated. He flopped a set and ends up losing. A little bit unlucky for him, but I guess in the end, the best hand pre-flop ended up winning. And just like that, we collect this $8,700 pot with pocket eights. In the next hand, there's an early position open to 75. I'm next to act with ace king suited, an absolute premium. Make it 250. Middle position cold calls, and the initial raiser calls as well. So 3 ways. We're monkey in the middle of this hand. Comes queen 8-7 with 1 heart. First player checks. I think already we have a decision here. Do we want to bet against 2 opponents or check and see what happens? I think both options make some sense. This time I decide to check it, and then the player behind me checks as well. So still 3 of us going to a turn, which is another heart. It's a 3 of hearts, giving me the nut flush draw, of course. Early position now leads out for $300. I don't think a raise makes much sense here, so I just call, and then the player behind me folds. So heads up to a river, looking for an ace, a king, or obviously a heart. And we get the best of the 3 options. It's a 10 of hearts, giving me the nuts. It's been a while since I made the nut flush on an unpaired board. Always a good feeling, knowing that for sure you were going to win this pot. It's just a question of how big will the pot get. Unfortunately, my opponent checks. Would have been nice to see a bet, but he thinks better of it on this run out. Good instinct on his behalf, but of course, he's going to have to face a bet. In terms of sizing, I don't think a giant size makes much sense. I settle on half pot, $650. My opponent doesn't seem to love it, but eventually he does call, and of course that's money coming our way. In the next one, action folds all the way around to the small blind who limps in, big blind limps in, and I am in the $50 straddle with 7-3 offsuit. I check my option, and we go 3 ways to a flop of 5-4-4 rainbow. Small blind checks, and now the big blind leads out for $75. Now I think this is indicative of a 5 more often than not. Maybe even a hand like ace-3 or ace-deuce that flops a straight draw and just decides to take a stab. I feel like if he had a 4 or 5-4, pocket 5s, you know, something super strong, he likely would not just lead out. So I decide to pounce on this with my straight draw. I think bluffing in position in a lot of these blind versus blind situations is a good option. It's a good strategy. Almost always will pay dividends, at least in my experience. So I make it 325. Small blind folds, big blind decides to call, which I think is standard if he does have a 5, but I think at this point he would have ditched a hand like ace deuce or ace 3. So most likely I think he's got a 5, maybe even like pocket 6s or whatever. Let's see what happens. Turn card is the king of clubs. He checks it over to me, and I am going to continue applying pressure. Now remember, pre-flop I just checked after they limped, so I could have all the possible 4s in the deck. Could also have a hand like 5-4 or pocket 5s myself. So I think it's okay to represent something good here. I put in $850, turning up the heat, trying to put this guy in a tough spot with a 5. Now he thinks it over for quite some time and calls again. So maybe we are in some trouble. I think at least he's got a 5, if not pocket 6s or maybe even 7s or 8s that just limps in pre-flop. So I'm probably going to shut it down on a couple of river cards, but I think still going for it might be our only option. Just depends what comes on the river. It's the deuce of diamonds. Now that's a pretty cool card because some straights get there. I have a 3, so I have removal to 6-3. I could also have ace-3 once in a blue moon. So he checks again, and now it's a question of do we want to give up or go for gusto? And ladies and gentlemen, you probably know where this is going. It's time to put in a big bet. If I had something strong, which I often might actually have, I think an overbet is in order. So I'm going to do the same here with 7 high. I throw in a bet of $3,500. Let's put this guy to the test if he's got a 5 or a pocket pair above the 5. Let's see if he's really got what it takes to make this call. He does not call right away, so that looks like good news. But then he does call. Darn it, that is not good news. But at least we get a good laugh out of it, because when he calls, I announce a straight. And he says, oh no, and I turn it over, and then he realizes I was just kidding, I don't have a straight. He flips over 8-4 suited and collects probably the biggest pot of the night. A bluff gone wrong from me, but a nice hand from him. Gotta give him credit for leading out on the flop with trips. It's kind of what got him paid. I definitely didn't see that coming. But yeah, lose a big one here. The night goes on. So we get knocked down a few pegs, but still winning on the night. Let's see if we can get things going back in the right direction. In this one, there's an early position open to $100, and I defend the big blind with 10-8 offsuit. We pick up the action, or at least we start filming the action on the flop, which comes down queen 9-6 rainbow. That's a double gutter, which means a 7 or a jack would give me a straight. I check it over to him, and he bets $75. I decide to take the aggressive route and check raise here with my straight draw. Could also be doing this with any flop 2 pair or a hand like pocket 9s, pocket 6s. So I think it's okay to balance it out with some bluffs here. Would be better to have a backdoor flush draw like 10-8 of diamonds or 10-8 of spades, but you guys get the point. My opponent makes the call after I make it 300, and we're off to a turn. 4 of diamonds brings no help to me. We do have a diamond in our hand, so it could potentially represent some backdoor flushes. I decide to bet small now. I think he might give me some credit for top pair or any sort of strong hand that decides to keep him in, if you will. I put in $250. I don't want to go too big because I feel like that might even look more suspicious against this particular guy. He makes the call, and we're off to a river, which of course we are looking for some help on, but it does not come. It's the deuce of diamonds. However, I did mention earlier, we have a diamond, could represent the flush. Instead, I decide to put in a little blocker bet. I would do this with a queen, maybe even a small 2 pair once in a while. I should say, however, I'm usually not a fan of small bets on the river. They're just so complicated to get right that you're better off just playing normal and betting like 2/3 or whatever. But I employ some fancy play syndrome, if you will, on this river. $175, expecting to get called more often than not. But the nice thing about betting small as a bluff is it doesn't need to work too often to be profitable. And what do you know, after around 30 seconds, he taps the table, says nice hand, and mucks his cards. Pretty sweet to win $1,300 in the middle while only risking $175. Not bad. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the last hand of tonight's session. In this one, there's one limper, the blinds limp along, and I'm in the straddle with 8-6 of diamonds. Should check here like 99% of the time, but I decide to raise. It's a suited gapper, it's got some playability post-flop, and I'm feeling like having a good time with a hand like this tonight. So I make it $350. First limper folds, but both of the blinds come along. So at least the good thing is we're in position. Flop comes down 5-5-4 with 1 diamond. So we've got 2 overs, straight draw, of course, we would improve on a 7, and the backdoor diamonds. Small blind and big blind check it over to me, and I decide to continue betting, hoping to get a heads up or just take it down right here. Plenty of turn cards that could help me continue to tell the story on the turn. So I throw in $350, small blind folds, but the big blind sticks around. Now this is the same player that I tried to bluff earlier with 7-3 offsuit. He's feeling himself. I don't blame him. Turn card is the 9 of spades, which is not the best. It brings in a potential flush. He checks it, and I think continuing to bluff on this card would be okay with some hands, but not my exact hand. So I decide to check it back, and we see the 3 of diamonds on the river. He checks it again, and you guys remember earlier how I said giving up on the river is okay sometimes? That statement is still true, but with my exact hand, once again, I don't think that's the right play. We don't have any removal to ace high, and I think that's the primary hand that we're trying to fold out with a bluff here. So I throw in around a half pot sized bet, $1,000. My opponent thinks it over for quite some time. Eventually he calls. I thought I might actually get some credit here because I bluffed him earlier, so I probably wouldn't try to bluff him again, right? I don't know. I'm just outthinking my own brain. It doesn't even make sense. We end up losing the pocket 7s, which I think is a pretty standard slash nice call from him. He did have a spade, which I think probably helped in his thought process. And yeah, that was the last one of the night. We don't end on the best note, but still had a great time. And as always, I hope you guys enjoyed the hands. So it's been a few days since that home game now. I actually filmed an outro right after the game, but for whatever reason, the audio in it was corrupted, so I'm re-summarizing that night for you guys here. Long story short, despite all the action hands that happened, I didn't really win or lose that much money. I think I ended up like $1,200, which of course is nothing to complain about, always better than losing. But that's been a game that has either been a lot of blood spilled for me or a lot of riches won. So this was an unexpected turn of events. But anyway, that was how my night went. As always, I hope you guys enjoy. I know it's a bit different than the high stakes hustler style vlogs. But yeah, on that note, I'm actually in Boston. That's where I'm filming this from. I might make a vlog here. I've never been here, but this is where Rampage is from. So maybe everyone else here is terrible at poker too. I guess we'll see. Anyway, as always, thank you guys for watching. Thanks for the support, and I'll see you all next time. Here is the Morongo details again, if you guys want to go to that. All right, until next time, good luck at your local tables. Peace.